Unsurprisingly, the shifting focus towards conquest near the end of the Viking Age actually caused raiding to phase out as the leadership of Scandinavia became more like their victims. To put it simply, the Vikingar may have won the battle, but it was European culture, Latin Christendom, that won the war. Even though Vikingar, like Knutr, conquered and ruled over England for short times, they often ruled according to English tradition and made few changes. He assimilated to their expectations by converting to Christianity, supporting the church, and levying taxes for revenue instead of raiding it from others. By the end of the Viking Age, around 965 onward, the sea kings of Scandinavia were converting to Christianity and embracing the form of governance that accompanied it: centralized, European-style kingdoms. For most of Scandinavia, then, conversion and centralization went hand in hand. This meant that the integration of Scandinavia into Latin Christendom was largely a top-down process, encouraged by elites who once again sought to reshape Scandinavia to a mold that most suited their political ambitions. The first of these European-style rulers was Harald Bluetooth of Denmark, who ruled from 958 to 87. He converted to Christianity in 965 and actively promoted it alongside his efforts to centralize power. The Yelling Stone, which is pictured on your screen right now, at least a replica of it, served as an expression of this effort. It not only combined pagan and Christian motifs, but also included an inscription that said, quote, "Harald, who won himself all of Denmark and Norway, and made the Danes Christian." End quote. The achievement of his centralization of authority was accompanied by a proclamation of conversion. Nevertheless, the transition still involved plenty of e-Viking, since Harald's successor, Svein Forkbeard, increased the wealth and authority of that kingdom by leading well-organized raiding campaigns against England, which eventually resulted in his son, Knutr, obtaining the English throne for Denmark. As time passed, however, that kind of raiding and foreign conquest became unnecessary, or at least impractical. After Knutr's death in 1035, authority in England went back to native dynasties by around 1042, and Scandinavian claims to their throne dwindled as they ended in failure. The most famous example of this was Harald Hardradi's attempt to claim it in 1066, which ended in his defeat and death at Stamford Bridge less than a month before the famous Battle of Hastings. As I mentioned earlier, that event is often used to mark the end of the Viking Age. But speaking more generally, it was around this time, that is 1050 or so, that Scandinavian elites truly transitioned away from raiding and focused instead on the benefits that a European-style monarchy could bring them at home. Small-scale raids by Vikingar continued in some places well into the 12th and 13th centuries. But rulers now had more reliable sources for revenue available to them at home through taxes, tolls, and fines. This meant that Scandinavian rulers no longer needed to rely on raiding to acquire their wealth and maintain their positions. Their authority was still challenged, of course, but it became increasingly difficult for ambitious individuals to do so, since Christianity also brought the ideology of divinely ordained kingship to the north. Nevertheless, these would-be Vikingar eventually turned to new methods, gaining status and wealth for themselves through service to the crown instead. Thus, the warriors of Scandinavia, who had once served warlords in exchange for gifts and land, had now become knights, serving a king for the same rewards. Since this lesson marks the end of Module 1, let me lay out our plans moving forward. This period, the Viking Age, will be our primary focus. I've used this lecture to give a brief overview of what we're dealing with, but we'll actually be covering this material and more in the lectures to come. Yet, to do so, we'll often be forced to consider sources that actually come after this period. In order to cover Norse mythology and saga literature, for instance, we'll inevitably touch on the history beyond the Viking Age, especially the 12th and 13th centuries. But since we have so much to cover, both domestically and overseas, the remainder of this course has been divided into two sections. Part 1, Culture and Society at Home, that is mythology, law, etc. and Part 2, Activities Abroad, that is raiding, trading, and exploration. This means we'll actually be talking about Norse mythology next, rather than Lindisfarne and early raids. So if you're looking for that, you'll have to wait until Part 2, or skip ahead if you're in the future. Nevertheless, we'll eventually end this course by talking in more detail about how the Sea Kings, leading the Viking God, evolved into Christian kings and integrated themselves into Latin Christendom. It's important to remember, though, that raids won't define this course. While they are the noisiest part of Viking history, we'll spend much more of our time learning about their culture, society, artistic endeavors, explorations, and even aspects of their daily life.